When talking about Frankenstein, it seems there's three distinct camps. The main one is the general public, who knows of Frankenstein mainly as a piece of pop culture and maybe a Halloween costume. Next would be the classic horror fans who know and love the Universal movies from the 30s and 40s. And lastly, there are the avid readers who would be most familiar with the original novel. What we're about to look at is, of course, none of the above. Whether you're a layman, a fan of horror cinema, or you're into romantic-era novels, I'm certain the first thing you think of when hearing the name Frankenstein isn't this. And it being lost for 70 years likely didn't help that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What we're discussing is the short film Frankenstein from 1910, directed by J. Searle Dawley, and produced by Edison Studios. It's notable for being the first ever adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel. Watching this feels like stepping into an alternate dimension. Most silent films give off that feeling simply because of how old they are. I mean, this movie's going on 112 years old. The grandchildren of the actors would even be pretty old by now. But on top of the age, the fact that it's such a different take on the story just makes it feel so strange. You might have noticed that I called it a short film. Well, I meant it, because this thing is 13 minutes long. It cuts all the fat. And most of the lean too, if I'm being honest. But for its age and its runtime, it's not half bad. Plus, at the start it even says a liberal adaptation. They aren't kidding. This is the most liberal adaptation I've seen since Frankenhooker.
Frankenhooker. Jeffrey Franken has a plan.
I just want to bring you back, Elizabeth.
He has the ingenuity.
I need female body parts.
He has everything he needs, except the raw materials.
The plot can be summarized pretty quickly. Basically, it's this. Frankenstein leaves for college, and 2 years later he discovers the mystery of life. That was quick, get used to it. He then writes to his sweetheart about his discovery, saying he is going to create the most perfect human being the world has yet known, after which he'll come home and marry her. Unfortunately, the evil in his mind causes him not to make a man with blonde hair and a tan, but a monster instead. This is shown through some actually really cool looking special effects, but I'll get to that. So after realizing what he's done, Victor gets spooked and runs back home. The creature pursues him as he tries to get married, and after chasing each other around a while, the monster looks into a mirror and is said to be overcome by love and disappears. The end. This is, of course, only the literal plot, and it's mainly told to us through inner titles at the beginning of each scene. It's almost comical how certain plot points had to be explained so simply that it almost felt like a children's book version of the story. Probably due to a lack of time or ability, they had to explain Frankenstein's creation turning out to be a monster as just the evil in his mind created a monster. It's like the movie itself is telling us its own symbolism. It's also funny how at the end, the monster is stated to be overcome by love and disappears, when it really looks like something else entirely is going on there. After all, it would be a while before silent films would truly master the art of conveying plot visually. And for that matter, they evidently hadn't had the idea to have the camera move either, cause that thing just stays glued in place. Most films at this point still felt like recorded stage plays. I couldn't find anything to confirm it, but I wouldn't be too surprised if this were to some degree based on an earlier stage production, but I digress. It's a fairly simple short, but there's still quite a bit of reading between the lines that can be done, particularly in that last scene. For one, it's clearly meant to imply that when looking into the mirror, Frankenstein sees himself as the real monster. I would imagine this is one of the earliest attempts at using special effects to convey some kind of symbolism in a film like this. When in its proper context, it's pretty impressive, even though that's most likely an idea inherited from theater productions. Another visual spectacle would have to be the monster itself, coming a while before Boris Karloff's lumbering, bolt-necked behemoth, but also long after Mary Shelley's philosophizing Prometheus. I would like to think of it as a crossroad, but it's quite different from either. This version of the monster is just so filthy and shabby looking, with his ragged, torn-up clothes, hunched back and misshapen head, on top of which sits a tangled nest of hair. But I must admit, it's a great look for him. The Edison monster is definitely less immediately threatening than the Karloff version, if only because of its size, but it is arguably much more monstrous looking. One of the more notable details about the creature would be that in one scene you can clearly tell it's meant to be talking. This definitely points more in the direction of the intelligent monster found in the book, In fact, much like what happens several times in the book, Frankenstein and his monster appear to be arguing over something. This may be more accurate to the novel than I thought, though we're never explicitly told what they're saying. It's kinda weird, I'm only just now realizing that there isn't actually any dialogue in the film whatsoever, besides Victor's letter to his sweetheart, but that barely counts. Nevertheless, this interpretation of the creature is also a big part of what makes this first adaptation feel so uncanny. It's hard to believe that there was in fact a short while when this is what moviegoers knew to be the Frankenstein monster. A very different interpretation, but in a sense it is iconic, at least as a symbol within the niche of early silent horror. And yes, that is quite niche. But hey, there have been a couple figurines made of it, that's something. However, I feel the most visually interesting element at play would have to be the creation sequence. The whole movie really does hinge itself on this one scene. It takes up about a quarter of the 13-minute runtime, and you can see why they would want this as the centerpiece of the movie. It could be because of how old the footage is, but this scene is still just so creepy. All they did was take the finished papier-mâché creature, burned it, and played it in reverse, but the effect remains very otherworldly. I can imagine this blowing some people's minds back in 1910. There had been plenty of trick films from people like George Méliès since at least the late 1890s, but I have a hard time thinking of anyone other than Méliès at the time who was using strange special effects as a narrative device like this. But if there's other stuff, do let me know in the comments. God knows I'm always looking for weird silent movie recommendations. It's funny how when the movie first came out, promotional material would try to make it sound like they'd removed anything frightening or potentially offensive that was in the original book so they could focus on the fantastical elements of the story, saying things like, "The Edison Company has carefully tried to eliminate all the actually repulsive situations and to concentrate its endeavors upon the mystic problems in this weird tale." But it just wound up scaring the shit out of people anyway. At least one magazine claimed it was far too frightening. I suppose people just weren't very receptive to the idea of a horror movie yet. Ironically, not scaring people off was a big part of why the movie was made to begin with. You see, moving pictures were a very young art form in 1910, and as people always do with something new, they freaked out and blamed it for all of society's ills. There were a growing number of reform groups, many of which sought to create new laws to police what could and couldn't be shown on film. Some communities even banned theaters altogether. Thomas Edison saw this, and being Thomas Edison, he of course immediately was concerned for how this would affect his profit margins and decided to self-censor before things got too out of hand. Edison, along with a trust of 9 other top film studios, went about creating a board of censors made up of religious leaders, educators, and executives. What would be the first movie to be made under the new banner of morally upstanding pictures? How about a classic moral tale about the consequences of man attempting God's work? That's right, they did Frankenstein. Undoubtedly, the other great part of self-censorship is that you can boast about it in advertisements. That's where all the talk of carefully removing all the repulsive situations fits in. Certainly a lot of the grim details were left out just for brevity's sake. Obviously there was nowhere near enough time to get into all that. However, the fact that the monster never kills anyone is a clear change made not to upset moviegoers. At the helm would be director J. Searle Dawley, who's most notable for being the apprentice of great train robbery director William S. Porter. On top of directing, Dawley also wrote the script, which must have taken him ages. Is overcome by love and disappears. The end. Okay, we're done. Let's go. He also practically filled the role of producer, being responsible for things like overseeing the construction of sets. Suffice to say, Dawley was in charge of the movie, answering only to the studio heads. Playing arguably the most important part would be Charles Ogle as the monster. He was a regular in Edison Pictures who would play various types of roles, and given that actors at the time were mainly responsible for their own costumes, he most likely came up with the design of the monster himself, though that is another element that likely draws on earlier stage productions. The title character of Victor Frankenstein was portrayed by another Edison stock player, Augustus Phillips, and his sweetheart, Elizabeth? Oh, that's what her name was? Product of its time, I guess. Well, she was played by Mary Fuller, who would later become the most well-known out of anyone in this cast, finding fame outside of Edison Studios. Not too much is known about the reception of Frankenstein upon release. After all, there were over 30 films released the same week. What is known, however, is that it wasn't terribly popular with audiences. It may have been the stagey way it was shot, or possibly because it was too frightening. There are reports of there being objections to the film within some communities. Despite the film trying to show Victor's efforts to play God as an objectively bad thing, some were upset for it being shown at all. This was also a time in which Darwinism was hotly debated, so anything involving the creation of man was bound to push some buttons. It's kind of a miracle there wasn't more controversy just because people thought they were mocking God. It seems that despite their best efforts to make a moral picture to please the more uptight types, they managed to get into trouble with it anyway. The story of how it was made is no doubt fascinating, but what's truly incredible is how Edison's Frankenstein was lost. You see, it was standard procedure for Edison Studios to make 40 prints of any given movie. They would then be sent to theaters who would show the films for about 7 months, after which they would be sent back to the studio to be stripped for silver. This is precisely what happened in 1910's Frankenstein. Though something odd happened about 2 decades after the release of the film. Universal decided to make their own interpretation of the Mary Shelley novel. It was a smash hit, and the name Frankenstein would forever be cemented in the ranks of horror icons. But it wouldn't be until 1963 that the existence of an earlier adaptation of Frankenstein would be uncovered by a historian looking through old magazines. Right on the cover of the March 15, 1910 issue of the Edison Kinetogram magazine was a picture of Charles Ogle as the Frankenstein monster in full makeup. There wasn't a lot of information, but it was plenty enough to prove the film did at least once exist. Movie buffs were enamored at the possibility of being able to see an earlier rendition of the 1931 classic, and several articles were published on this new discovery. In 1980, the American Film Institute even included Edison's Frankenstein on their list of the top 10 most significant lost films. This publication would in turn come to the attention of the eccentric film collector Alois Detlaff Sr. You see, Detlaff's wife's grandmother was in show business way back when, and when she left the business, she took a decent-sized collection of film reels with her. Through very roundabout means, these reels would eventually land in Detlaff's hands in the 1950s. As you may have guessed, one of these reels was in fact the only extant copy of Edison Studios' Frankenstein. Reportedly, he would show these reels to his children as a way of teaching them to read. As he was showing them the reels, he noticed that part of Frankenstein had shrunken due to age and set it aside. It would of course be the AFI list in 1980 that made him truly realize what he had. From here things get a bit tricky. By this point, Detlaff had already become highly protective of his Frankenstein print. This is partially because he'd allowed the BBC to use a few clips, which shortly after would end up in various video compilations without permission. But another factor would have to be the fact that he imagined the value of his print to be much higher than it really was. After all, rarity and antiquity don't always equal monetary value. Just ask anyone who collects 78s. This protectiveness would cause him to be highly reluctant to release the film in any capacity, well, besides a quote-unquote copyright-protected version he donated to the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, which had a large copyright notice scrolling through the middle of the screen through the entire film, making it very difficult to watch. Despite not wanting to show anyone the film, he did at least create safety prints using a modified step printer for the parts that had shrunk. But eventually, either due to pressure or perhaps just loosening up a bit, Detlaff finally had a public showing of Frankenstein in 1993 at the Avalon Theater in Milwaukee. This led to several more public screenings, and in 2003 he even decided to officially release the film on DVD, albeit with all of the flaws of the original print intact. Despite all its imperfections, this release finally, once again, made Edison's Frankenstein accessible to the public at large over 90 years after its initial release. Sadly, only 2 years after releasing the film on DVD, Alois Detlaff passed away at the age of 84. But 9 years later, the Library of Congress was finally able to purchase the entirety of his film collection, which also happened to contain other elusive films, namely The Two Orphans from 1915. Since then, they've done a 2K scan of Frankenstein and completely digitally restored the film. They even hired composer Donald Sosin to create a new score for accompaniment, which is great because some older YouTube uploads have some pretty weird choices of background music. This restoration has also been posted to the Library of Congress official YouTube channel, making it readily available to anyone, anywhere in its original red and blue tinted glory. You can wear 3D glasses, just don't expect them to do anything. It appears that at long last, the strange saga of the original Frankenstein movie has come to a close. Over the last century, the film has gone from ignored to lost to confined, and then of course found, restored, and made fully accessible. Now this black sheep can be appreciated for what it is, a very different interpretation that despite all its simplicities is beautiful in its own way. Who knows, maybe if it was rediscovered sooner, the Universal monster might not be the only thing that comes to mind when people think of Frankenstein. However, if Universal never made the 31 version, people might not have been as excited at the idea of finding the original. If one thing's certain, it's that Universal made Frankenstein into an icon of horror in 1931. But it's always important to remember the pioneer that tried it first. Hey, I hope you enjoyed the video. It took me quite a while to get this one done, actually like a few months, on and off, sort of. But I feel like it turned out pretty well in the end. And it's something I'd been wanting to do for quite a while, because I could hardly find anyone talking about this subject on YouTube at all. So yeah, hope you liked it. You can comment and let me know what you think about it, if you want. Really just put whatever down there, I don't really care. Tell me about your day. Good for the algorithm or something like that, engagement. And speaking of which, you can also, you can like and subscribe. Like, and you can subscribe. There should be a button to subscribe on the screen somewhere right now. And whenever I have any other videos out, they'll probably be in boxes somewhere on the screen here. And also links to the actual Frankenstein movie and all the sources that I used will all be in the description. So I think that's all. Yeah, have a nice day.